Obviously, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this panel. The perspective that I present is really that of a human rights defender. I look only at the EU's human rights policy and evaluate in that sense. I think the starting point, in order to answer your question, is that I agree that there is a huge problem with credibility in terms of the EU's policy on human rights towards, I look at the region of North Africa primarily. I mean, obviously working on Libya in 2009 and 2010 and being told very openly by governments that migration policy, i.e. keeping migrants away from European shores, was a priority, or that, that Gaddafi had changed and that there were new and exciting business opportunities in Libya, and the fact that there was very, very little in even discussing human rights at that point is something that Libyans, whether human rights defenders or otherwise, were fully aware of. Likewise, with Tunisia, at one point in 2008, I participated in a bit of a study in Tunisia where we went round EU embassies to examine the extent to which the EU guidelines on human rights defenders were being applied. And even though there was a local implementation strategy, our conclusion was that these guidelines were in effect not being used to the full extent of their potential. And I mean, an obvious conclusion, given the fact that certain European countries, in particular France in the context of Tunisia, had an interest in limiting the EU's human rights policy in the context of Tunisia. And in Egypt, what we used to hear on a regular basis was when we asked why certain human rights, again looking at human rights guidelines or discussions within the context of the subcommittee on human rights or conclusions of the Association Council or public statements from the delegation or from Catherine Ashton's office, when we asked why there wasn't a stronger statement or why a position wasn't taken on issue X, the answer would frequently be, well, we have to be realistic, you have to be realistic, we need good relations, we have interests that we need to protect. Egypt's geostrategic position is obviously the overriding principle. We need stability in Egypt. And obviously, we need stability in Egypt at the time was also code for a recognition that the Mubarak policies, the Mubarak regime's repressive policies in keeping Islamists in Egypt, the Islamist opposition down, was something for which, repressing them, was something for which there was, at a minimum, European acquiescence, if not enthusiasm, on some parties. And that is a legacy that Europe will also have to deal with in dealing with the new leadership in Egypt. The responses would also, at times, about very specific questions, would give a lot of leeway to the Mubarak regimes, especially sort of the more modern economic reform-minded presentation of the face of the Mubarak regime in 2010, would actually, in many ways, actually take on some of the arguments presented. So, when we asked in 2010 why the renewal of the state of emergency was not strongly criticized by the EU. In fact, the EU failed to actually criticize the renewal itself, just made a general recommendation that any counterterrorism laws being developed be consistent with international law. The response there was, well, the Egyptian Foreign Ministry asked us not to be too critical because they are planning to reform. And that was actually a response given to a human rights organization. So with this in the background, of course there is a credibility problem. And I mean, the conclusion really is, I think, after the many years in which I, in the context of international organizations, have spoken to the EU, whether to EU embassies at the capital level, sometimes in Brussels, and sometimes in other capitals, my conclusion is basically that the EU doesn't want a serious human rights policy. There simply isn't the political will to back up the mechanisms that exist, whether, everything ranging from the guidelines to even these new commitments that we've seen in the context of the new European neighborhood policy. So question of the recognition in early 2011 that the EU had given support to a repressive regime, and the recognition that that support was in fact not a guarantee of long-term stability, but that on the contrary, a policy that is based on respect for human rights would be more of a guarantee. A regime that respects human rights will be more stable than one which represses human rights in the way the Mubarak regime did, is what gave birth to the more for more, and I think the part that is often forgotten, the less for less part of it. Later.